They told me the dock belonged to everyone, that the water was a neighborhood thing, that the gates and slips were for the community. That's what they said in the flyers, on the benches, in the little smiley emails from the HOA, and for a long time, I believed them, because believing that keeps your mornings simple, keeps your coffee lighter, keeps your temper softer. Then one day, I found an old paper in a box of tools, and everything that felt like peace turned into paperwork, and the quiet turned into a kind of war I never saw coming. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm the kind of man who learned to read balance sheets like some people read maps. You could tell the lay of a place by its numbers and its margins. I sold my small manufacturing business a few years back, moved out of the city, bought a little plot with a boathouse attached at Cedar Hollow Marina, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without the calendar on my chest. The marina was supposed to be the final chapter of a life that had too many spreadsheets and too few sunsets. I wanted a porch chair that said, "You made it," and the lake looked like it could carry that sentence for me. The first time I saw her in person was at the annual neighborhood picnic. She came in like the kind of person who'd been appointed by destiny to look after things. Marla Vance, bright scarf, perfect laughter, the kind of voice that folds a room into whatever mood she's chosen that day. She had a way of saying "we" that made people think she'd been elected by the angels, and for a while, people tied their shoelaces to that "we" and walked along. At first it was small things. A note on the gate about slip registrations. A suggestion in the newsletter that community events should include the marina. "We just want to share," Marla said once. When I saw her at the coffee stand, like sharing was the default human behavior, and anyone who objected must be an outlaw. I listened with a patient chuckle. I mailed the forms back. I paid small fees. I smiled at the potluck line and thought, this is neighborly. Then one afternoon, while I was fixing the boat radio, I found the deed. It was in a folder with an old title for the boathouse and the original sale documents from when the developer had finished the marina. My fingers froze over the paper, the kind of stillness that you notice too late. The deed named the marina parcel as belonging to the original developer, and there was a faint chain of assignments. The last entry, dust-streaked and almost apologetic, showed a purchase in my name. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a community myth. The slips I walked past every morning were my property. The docs were recorded in the county clerk's ledger under my name. I mailed the recorded copy to myself and sat on the dock until the sun slid under the trees. Ownership is a strange thing. It is both a set of rights and a weight. You feel more of responsibility than privilege when you hold paper saying something is yours. I wanted to be fair. I wanted to be neighborly. I also knew what it felt like to be stripped of a thing that mattered. I decided to tell Marla. I figured transparency would be a kindness. I thought it would avoid drama. "You own the marina?" she asked, the second I told her. Her smile didn't break. "Oh, I didn't realize. That's not interesting." Her tone was the kind that kept a blade in velvet. The next newsletter was friendly as ever. "Community access is being reviewed," it said, with a pastel border and a photograph of toddlers I didn't know. The words came with a signature I recognized, Marla's. The message underlined the idea. This was Cedar Hollow, and Cedar Hollow belonged to Cedar Hollow. We argued in polite emails at first, and that's when the machinery of the HOA, I learned its grooves quickly started to purr. Notices, then fines, then a proposed amendment. Marina usage for all residents. The board met in a room with fluorescent lights and a coffee pot that never quite emptied. Marla led the charge with a practiced hand. People showed up to nod, some showed up to glare. A few neighbors hugged me and said, "Ethan, you don't have to deal with this," which is a kind sentiment, except the way it frames you is as someone who can be spared. Everything escalated in ways that felt childish and legal at the same time. One morning, I found a folded note taped to my door, "Why buy if you won't share?" followed by a handful of signatures. It read like a petition written at the back of a PDA flyer. Then someone nobody volunteered a name put up a flyer on the marina bulletin board with a picture of my boat and the word private stamped across it, like a scar. They complained I wasn't community-oriented, as if civic life were a club and I didn't know the password. The first real breach of civility came when they staged a marina day. 40 neighbors arrived with folding chairs and a grill. They wanted an open day to celebrate community, which is a lovely thing if your idea of community doesn't include commandeering someone else's property. Marla walked up the planks with a clipboard and a megawatt smile. "That's a beautiful boat you have, Ethan," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Then, almost as an aside, "and we're here to make sure it's shared." She invited everyone onto the deck. I remember feeling my knuckles go white on the railing. It was a gentle invasion, the kind that comes with casseroles and choir practice. A woman set down a casserole on my deck. A man opened the cabin and pretended to look at the compass. I called the sheriff. The deputies came, took the tense temperature of the scene, and, after a polite conversation, asked to see the documentation. I handed them the recorded deed. They leaned back, looked at each other, and told Marla plainly that without a legal instrument to take possession, the boat and the slips remained my property. The look on Marla's face, the kind that waits a beat to let the room catch up, told me we wouldn't be having gentle disagreements anymore. That's when the campaign turned personal. It's a weird gradient, how civic policy slips into private attack. Notices turned into veiled accusations. Suddenly I was hoarding resources, privatizing the lake, isolating the community. People I'd waved at for years walked by with a softness in their gaze that made me feel unclean. My mail had begun to smell like inked scorn. We live in neighborhoods where reputations move faster than deeds. Names have a way of settling. Vandalism came later, when they realized the law wasn't an immediate tool for exclusion. One night someone cut the anchor ropes, another night they slashed the tarp. I installed security cameras, and when I reviewed the footage, my stomach dropped. Grainy images showed a young man on the dock at 2:13 a.m., cap low, hands quick. His gait was familiar, a neighbor's child, a builder's son. It turns out the boy worked with Marla's brother. I took the footage to the sheriff, and the next morning a subpoena made its way into my inbox like a warning. The board called an emergency meeting. At that meeting, I played the footage. I didn't expect the silence that followed. Video has a way of leveling pride. Faces that had been smugly distant were suddenly pale. Marla smiled tight, and then she said, "We need to look at all sides." That was the day I realized there was another kind of power at play, narrative control. If you're the person who sets the story, whether someone is a greedy owner or a hard-working neighbor, half the war is already won. My lawyer, Claire Bennett, reminded me of things I already knew in principle but needed to hear aloud. Documentation matters. Don't let emotion drive you. Use the law's neat angles. Claire was the kind of attorney who enjoyed the architecture of a case she liked to build. We gathered records, filed complaints, and let the mechanisms of the system begin to turn. We subpoenaed the HOA records and found line items that made my eyebrows lift. Payouts to vendors without invoices, questionable maintenance charges, and a check written to a now-closed LLC with a name that matched Marla's contractor. There was money moving around like smoke. When you gather documents, you take the abstract and make it tactile. I remember the moment clearly. Claire spread a stack on the table like a magician revealing cards, and the light through the window turned the papers into evidence. "This isn't just about your dock," she said. "This is about governance. If the board is misusing funds, the community has a right to know." It's funny how the word right can sound both like virtue and like a technicality. Marla fought back with a different strategy: humiliation and narrative. She organized neighborhood forums where she spoke about unity and tradition and used those words the way a sword is used to mark lines. She accused me of being an outsider, of using legal muscle to bully. She suggested that my purchase had been a private coup. She called it the Marina Takeover, on a flyer with a font that wanted drama. Neighbors who had never spoken at board meetings suddenly had strong opinions about land use. I started to feel the erosion of ordinary civility, not because the laws changed, but because people's instincts for solidarity had been trained to prefer belonging to a group over standing by a person. That's the cruelty of small communities sometimes. They have a way of self-policing that becomes brutish. The turning point came in a place I didn't want it to: the clubhouse. Marla arranged a presentation about community stewardship and invited everyone. She invited the press, it seemed, the type of local columnist who writes with a friendly smirk. She asked me to come, perhaps expecting me to decline. I walked in with Claire at my side, and the room smelled of coffee and old wood. Midway through her speech, I asked a simple question into the microphone. How does an HOA override a recorded deed? It was meant to be a precise, professional question, but in that silence the room felt like a courtroom. People shifted in their seats. Someone gulped. Marla's smile thinned. She fumbled words about bylaws and precedent, and her answers sounded to me like someone trying to fix a crack in a wall with wallpaper. After the meeting, a neighbor named Harold, who had been on the fence for a long time, tapped my shoulder and said, "Ethan, I never wanted this to be ugly." He was a man who loved his lawn and his Sunday paper. He looked at me like he wanted to be reassured. "Sometimes," I said, and I meant it, "standing on paper is the most honest thing you can do." He nodded like a man who's had a window opened. Legal processes are slow, and they smell like bureaucracy. You file, you wait, you file again, you gather testimony, you subpoena bank records. Meanwhile, people get impatient, and rumors fill the vacuum left by the system's glacial pace. The board tried to name me an enemy of the community on social media, and that's when the campaign of small cruelties turned darker. Someone trespassed and left a smear of paint on the boathouse, an act of vandalism that felt like a declaration. Another night my storage locker was pried open. Nothing of great monetary value was taken, but the message was clear: we could penetrate your privacy. When the county auditor's office responded to our complaint, they didn't make a big show. They requested documents. They tracked payments. They asked for invoices that didn't exist. They compared the HOA's contracted maintenance to what was actually done around the marina. The auditor's report that finally landed in our hands was dry prose with heavy meaning. It noted insufficient documentation for several disbursements and flagged a pattern of payments to individuals and entities tied unusually close to board leadership. The finding didn't scream corruption in the sensational sense. It used terms like insufficient transparency and inadequate oversight, but in the careful language of bureaucracy that's often as close to thunder as you get. Marla's response was theatrical deflection. She called a new meeting, framed the audit as a misunderstanding, and turned her mouth toward the room like a preacher. But the seed of doubt had been planted. People who had once accepted her words without question started asking for receipts. They started reading the newsletters with more squint and less trust. Once you invite inspection into a system that has been accustomed to privacy, small things begin to look like patterns. The night of the vote of no confidence, the rain was polite, persistent, thin, almost as if the sky had been taking notes. The hall filled with neighbors. Some wore jackets that said, "I support Cedar Hollow." Others had faces that looked like they had been arguing with themselves for days. Marla stood at the front in a bright blouse, and for the first time I saw the trace of uncertainty in her posture. Words hung in the space like heavy paper lanterns. I remember the clerk reading the motions slow, deliberate, procedural, and then the ballots were counted. When the clerk announced the result, The sound that came from the crowd wasn't solely triumph. It was the release of something that had been coiled too long. Marla had been removed as HOA president. Some people clapped. Some sat down limp and quiet. Others cheered like they had been given back a right they didn't know they'd lost. She left with a smile that tried to make itself appropriate, and the doors closed behind her in the way doors close on chapters. Even with the victory, the settlement didn't feel like a movie ending. Claire negotiated a settlement that included restitution, a modest sum covering the damages, and a formal agreement recognizing my recorded ownership while allowing regulated, fee-based access to slips for neighbors who wanted it. It was compromise and principle folded into one package. I got an apology letter from the HOA board, the sort written with lawyers in mind, and a promise of governance reforms. The sheriff's office charged the young man who'd cut ropes with misdemeanor vandalism. The contractor tied to the payments received an inquiry. It felt like a cleanup, not a catharsis. In the weeks after, neighbors came back to the dock with casseroles that were genuinely meant, with serviceable smiles and soft talk. We walked side by side again in those mornings when the fog sat like a blanket over the water. But things had changed. People were more cautious about the words they used. They were more willing to ask questions. They had seen the way quiet control could masquerade as benevolence. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted and oddly maternal toward my little piece of land, like it had been ill, and I'd helped nurse it back. I thought about power differently now. It isn't always about money or titles. Sometimes it's about who gets to tell the first story. It's about how quickly a group can forget someone's rights when fear or convenience or charisma sweeps a decision into motion. A month after the vote, the marina reopened under the new agreement. We installed clear signage that explained slip policy, and we implemented an online reservation system so people could book time without having to argue or digest meetings. The tensions didn't evaporate, but they softened like ice in a warm glass. People who had cheered at my side started asking about my life, my past business, whether I liked fishing, whether I planned to sell. We shared a few grill evenings that felt like repair work, real things, not performative. On an evening with air so clean it felt like it could cut through memory, I walked out on the dock alone. The boat rocked gently. The light went a peculiar blue. I thought about the lines I crossed. I had not wanted conflict, none of us do, but I had wanted dignity for the small things that make a life whole. When you stand up for what's on paper and what's right, you sometimes have to be willing to sit in the uncomfortable silence that follows. There are costs to these battles. There are friendships frayed, Sunday routines disturbed, a weight of vigilance you carry in the small hours. But there's also a lesson that can't be taught otherwise. The law is only as strong as the people who choose to use it, not to win, but to hold a community to its own promises. We learn that paperwork isn't just ink. It's a map of who we are supposed to be to each other. I won't tell you I became a different man overnight. I still enjoy a good spreadsheet, and I still like the way morning looks from the starboard side. But I learned to listen more carefully to what we really means. Sometimes we is a polite fiction, a shortcut to avoid inconvenient conversations. Sometimes we is a genuine holding out of hands. The tricky part is knowing which is which. If I had to offer a small, practical note because part of my life still likes utility, it would be this. Know what you own. Keep records. When something communal feels like it's being reshaped around eagerness or charisma, request receipts. Ask for invoices. Ask for minutes. Nobody likes a bureaucrat in a friendly town, but they do like a neighbor who asks questions that keep the lights on. And for those of you watching who live in neighborhoods like mine, tell me, when does community become control? When is consensus a virtue? And when is it a weapon? If you could vote right now, would you side with the idea that everything must be shared? Or would you insist that ownership means something even if it makes you an outlier? Drop a comment below and tell me about your neighborhood story, the times you stood up, the times you wished you had, and the things you think make community real. Share this with someone who likes a quiet mystery about property and power, and if you stayed until the end, hit like, not for me, but for the idea that sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that teach a neighborhood to read its own books. If you think about it, justice isn't always dramatic. It's mostly paperwork, a few brave witnesses, a camera that records what we all hope to pretend didn't happen, and neighbors who choose investigation over rumor. Tell me where you stand on ownership, on community, on the thin line between being neighborly and being taken advantage of. The lake is calm tonight, but it remembers everything. I'd like to know what your lake remembers.